One of the quirkiest and yet fondly remembered, as well as the most critically heralded of Image's earliest releases, the Maxx has unfortunately proven as much of a burden to Sam Kieth as a blessing in many ways. In fact, if you were to read what Sam Kieth has to say about the series, you'd probably run screaming in the other direction. From the moment the series started with great prosperity and somewhat undesired notoriety, also came difficult decisions and long, thankless hours of work. Caught in a dream that would soon become a waking nightmare for the soft-spoken artist, Sam Kieth was on the verge of becoming an icon in modern comics and losing it all in the blink of an eye. As disenfranchised at one point with the Maxx as he may have ever possibly been interested in the character, after years of toiling away on other people's creations, what spurred the aspiring young artist, who by all rights was just starting to really come into his own on his incredibly successful Marvel Comics Presents cover run, which is still heralded as one of the high watermarks of the 90s comic art movement, to completely sever ties with that company and get in bed with their competition overnight. And why does Sam Kieth seem to dislike the Maxx so much? Join me tonight as we continue our multi-part examination of Kieth's career and a little tasty tidbit of tawdry industry trivia and another one of comics' greatest stories never told, How the Maxx Broke Sam Kieth Part 2, The Nightmare of Success. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, do me a favor and hit that like button. Think about getting in the comments section below and letting me know. And if you really enjoy what you see, make sure you hug smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page, make a donation via Ko-Fi, pick up a shirt, or use the join button to sign up for membership right here on YouTube. But now, let's get into it. For more than 6 years, there was veritably no news about the Maxx. Nothing, not a peep. Sam Kieth, who had transformed his blog into his new fashion of communicating and interacting with his fans by this point, would post images of original or unseen Maxx art, but other than that, it was all quiet on the Western Front, aside from a single story for a Hero Initiative comic anthology in 2014, which featured an all-new Maxx story. Kind of. The self-satirical nature of the hero comic story, which is essentially Dave, Julia, and Mr. Gone explaining why the Maxx doesn't really make sense, and why Sam Kieth should never return to the series, only helped to reinforce the fact that most fans were long since resigned to what seemed the inevitable and simple truth. Sam Kieth would never return to the property ever again. He might do an illustration or something fun like the Hero Initiative short, but he'd said in so many interviews over the years, he told all the stories he had to tell. He wasn't overly fond of a lot of the Maxx, and there was no going home for him, no matter how hard he tried. While it was an invariable question in almost any mainstream interview you read with him, the answer was just as predictable. It got to the point where he seemed to be reading his answers off of a cue card, they were so similar. Most serious fans of Sam Kieth knew good and well to kind of just steer clear of the property for the most part, and certainly not to beg or pester him for new work. The pressure from fans as well as publishers had eased over the years, and I think this may have indeed been one of the reasons for what came next. To say Sam Kieth's announcement in July of 2013 came out of the blue and as a huge shock to the majority of his fans would be the understatement of the century. In 2013, during the Maxx's 20th anniversary, the rights had reverted back to Sam Kieth. Despite having spent years trying to do anything but the Maxx, Sam Kieth made a decision that left many longtime fans completely blown away. He announced at the 2013 San Diego Comic-Con he had plans to return to his seminal creation, the Maxx, for the first time in any kind of big way since 1998. It wasn't necessarily in the way that a lot of people would have liked, though. At Comic-Con, Sam Kieth announced IDW would be releasing what was subsequently dubbed maximized editions of all 35 original issues of the Maxx. The series, however, would not be a traditional reprinting in a few ways. all of the original art, where available, was going to be completely rescanned and cleaned up. Some people's eyebrows raised, however, when it was announced there were even some cut and unused sequences which helped tie up some story and plot threads that were inserted back into their original intended place in the story. I understood the art being rescanned. There had always been a lot of loss when it came to reproducing someone like Sam Kieth's work in a comic book, especially during the 90s. It made sense to go back and try to get that art looking the way it was supposed to look when it was originally released. Sam Kieth continually claimed that the series, quote, wasn't broke and he, quote, wasn't going to fix it, and even went so far as to reference George Lucas's treatment of Star Wars at one point. But the idea of inserting unused material and essentially tampering with page layouts and all of the heavy connotations that this would imply, let's just say that didn't sit awful well with some people, especially with how Sam Kieth was bandying about the idea of disliking quote-unquote director's cuts and saying over and over again how the Maxx wasn't broken to begin with. My own thoughts on the Maximized project as a whole aside, personally, I was happy when Sam Kieth announced the project for somewhat unrelated reasons in retrospect. This was obviously a way for Sam Kieth to get a little bit of the money that he had been missing out on with the Maxx for the past 15 years, or maybe even 20 years. Considering how little merchandise there had ever been and how long ago those books came out, I did not begrudge him a penny. I was excited to pick up the floppies again, if only to help monetarily incentivize Sam Kieth into working on the character further in the future maybe. While I and everyone else knew this would never be new Maxx material, when he announced he would also be doing a series of 35 all-new Maxx paintings to accompany the covers of the IDW Maximized series, it felt like perhaps this meant Sam Kieth was finally coming to terms with the Maxx and what it meant for his legacy. I mean, he could run, but there was no hiding from the 300-pound purple rabbit in the corner of the room wearing a lampshade, mumbling to himself. It was inescapable. As further details emerged about the Maximized project following San Diego Comic-Con, though, I have to admit, I was more than slightly disappointed. On one hand, I was really excited to see Sam Kieth revisiting the Maxx for the first time in so many years. He'd been pretty clear he had no desire to return to the character. So these 35 new covers were really cool to see and may well have proven to be his swan song for the character as far as we knew. Though this is obviously proven not to be the case, these covers were likely integral to what would come after the Maximized series for the Maxx and Sam Kieth. The covers in many ways felt like a much lower pressure, much higher return way of Sam Kieth dipping his foot back into the character. And again, getting a little bit of money and seeing how many people were interested in actually still buying the Maxx. I could have overlooked the reinserted material. In fact, I wanted to see it. I wasn't sure about messing with the page layouts, but I trusted Sam Kieth to not unnecessarily tamper. Truth be told, I was voracious for even just a few more precious panels from what I honestly believe is one of the greatest series of all time. I wasn't necessarily super enthused, though, that they were being reinserted into the pages. But hey, they were going back and rescanning every bit of original art that they could get their hands on, and with the help of Jen Sinclair, that turned out to be almost every single piece. Knowing all the neat little details that were invariably lost in the printing process around that time, I was excited, if admittedly a little trepidatious, about Maximized. Until Sam Kieth announced that the original colors by Steve Oliff, Ruben Rood, and Ollie Optics were going to be entirely redone by Rhonda Pattison. Sam Kieth was probably primarily aware of Pattison as she was an IDW staffer at the time, though he does specifically note having enjoyed her colors on the work she's received most acclaim for, Atomic Robo, an independent publication out of Canada. Personally, I was dumbfounded. It's not that Pattison's untalented, or I thought she would do a bad job. I just did not understand Sam Kieth recoloring the Maxx at the time. Steve Oliff's colors were just as evocative of the Maxx as Sam Kieth's line work or Jim Sinclair's inks were for that matter. You have to understand, Olaf was akin to royalty when I was growing up. Ollie Optics wasn't just some name when it came to color, it was the name. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why Sam Kieth would want to recolor the book. It would take some time, but eventually I came to understand why Sam Kieth was intent on recoloring the book, and it was not some random lark. The reasons reach almost as far back as the beginning of the Maxx's publication, actually. Almost as far back as I can find mention of them, the colors on the Maxx had bothered Sam Kieth. The reasons behind Pattison's recoloring the Maxx are actually deceptively complex and interesting, and get into some interesting 90s image publication trivia. So you know I couldn't help myself. As far back as the second issue, there have been innumerable letters complimenting the amazing job that Steve Olaf and his team at Ollie Optics, including Ruben Rude, were doing on the series published in Maxx Tracks. The bright, outlandish colors became as synonymous with Sam Kieth's work on the Maxx as almost any other aspect or element of the book, Sam Kieth's art aside. In interviews, even years prior to the Maximize series, though, Sam Kieth recalls getting really excited seeing the initial colors that Steve Olaf and Ollie Optics would lay out for him on a light box, and then how disappointed with their lackluster appearance on the printed page he was. Steve Olaf would explain that unless they had every fan light box the pages themselves at their houses, it was never going to reproduce like that. Printing technology just wasn't there yet. Although Image and Olaf's work on books such as the Maxx helped to change that, I know Sam Kieth was never fully pleased with the colors. It wasn't just something he pulled out of a hat or anything. But over the years, Sam Kieth has also said his opinion about the Maxx doesn't really matter. It's not up to him to decide what's good or bad. It's up to the readers and the fans to decide what they do and don't like. And when it came to the Maximized recoloring, I was kind of torn. Steve Olaf was the guy who basically came up with the computer coloring for comics as we know it. While there had been some computer coloring work done before Steve Olaf, his work on the epic translation of Akira would radically change what people thought was possible with the then current coloring and printing limitations. While it was vastly more expensive and it took a lot of convincing for Marvel to finally allow him to do it to begin with, Steve Olaf landed the job on Akira mostly because he was personally selected by creator Katsuhiro Otomo himself from among thousands of possible applicants, all vying to work on the English adaptation. Olaf pioneered color work on computers, but was an odd man out even in that world at this point. While the majority of art done with digital technology hinged on the usage of more expensive Macintosh computers, Olaf revolutionized the industry while working entirely on a PC, utilizing the Pixelcraft software. Another often overlooked yet extremely important thing that Olaf was instrumental in was having his color guide artist do the color separations. I know it doesn't sound like a huge thing, but this eliminated an enormous part of the guessing game that many colorists played when passing off their finished color guides, and helped further dial in the accuracy and intent with which Olaf and Ollie Optics worked. I'm not going to get into an entire other video here trying to break down every reason that Steve Olaf is important, or just how many ways he was pushing the limits as far as coloring went at the time. But it suffice to say, there have been few colorists who have ever achieved Olaf's level of prominence and name recognition in the field by fans as well as professionals, and that's for good reason. Steve Olaf was radically redefining what was possible with the limited printing technology still used at this time in the late 80s and early 90s, and it was actually during the initial publication of Epic's Akira translation around this period, just as Olaf was really coming into his own, after hundreds of stories, that Olaf was recruited for colors on the first issue of Epicurus the Sage in November of 1989. Sam Kieth and Steve Olaf worked extremely well together, and while he was extraordinarily busy with Akira, Olaf and Ollie Optics had just started to really expand into work for the Big Two when the second issue of Epicurus came out. Since they went way back, and I know Sam Kieth was not only pulling story ideas from off of the shelf, but also names of people he'd enjoyed working with out of the Rolodex, well, I don't know that Steve Olaf was part of the original plan that Sam Kieth had when he set out to assemble his dream team for the Maxx. I strongly suspect this to be the case. While Steve Oliff and Sam Kieth's names would become almost inseparable for a number of years, when Image first came onto the scene in 1992, Steve Oliff started off at the company exclusively on Todd McFarlane's Spawn. Todd McFarlane and other Image founders were not super pleased with the initial colors on Youngblood, Rob Liefeld included. Over the next several years, Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee, Eric Larson, Todd McFarlane, and the rest of Image increasingly looked to Steve Oliff for his expertise and skills in order to help them stand out among the crowded newsstands of the early 90s landscape. Suddenly, Steve Oliff and Ollie Optics were literally deluged with work. With humble beginnings on Spawn at Image, by 1993, Oliff and Ollie Optics had quickly become the colorists for the majority of Image's heaviest hitters and were in the employ of some of the biggest names to have ever worked in comics. Following the jaw-dropping colors on Spawn 1, Eric Larson would recruit Ollie Optics for Savage Dragon, Rob Liefeld got them to do work on his Youngblood Strike file, and last but not least, Dale Keown also tapped Ollie Optics for work on Pit not long after this. It was during this time of overabundance that Sam Kieth approached Steve Oliff about work on the Maxx. Oliff had already won a Harvey Award in 1990 and 1991 for his coloring, but as he really came into his own with the help of Image Comics, Oliff would sweep the Harvey and Eisner Awards, winning Best Colorist in 92, 93, 94, and 95 for his work on Spawn. Although Steve Oliff had started off doing all of the color separations by hand himself, by the end of 1993, he was simply too busy. Unable to hand assemble color guides himself all the time anymore, Steve Oliff hired a number of people and promoted others. This is where a guy named Ruben Rude comes in. Rude was with Ollie Optics for a number of years, and he's one of the other major names that you see consistently pop up in the Maxx from beginning to end. Rude and Ollie Optics' color work would go on to become as much a part of the series as just about anything else aside from Sam Kieth's art, in my opinion. During his years on the series, Ruben Rude developed and refined an impressive array of colors, palettes, and displayed an uncanny ability in reproducing Sam Kieth's painted and mixed media panels, in my opinion. But that was Ruben Rude, not Steve Oliff. While I know for a fact that Steve Oliff worked on the Maxx himself where and when he could, that was a small window of time considering just how busy Ollie Optics was during the height of the Maxx's popularity in 1993 and 1994. Regardless of his prominence or my love for the work, as I've mentioned, Sam Kieth has complained about Oliff and Ollie Optics' color work on the Maxx for quite a while. Feeling like they lacked the pop that he would see in samples, Sam Kieth lamented in a number of interviews, as well as the introduction to one of the Maximized collections actually, that it was probably his fault the colors weren't everything that they should have been. Sam Kieth says he was almost always late, sometimes giving Steve Oliff and his crew only a single weekend to color an entire comic book as one of the reasons that Steve Oliff's colors weren't nearly as strong as he felt like they could have, or perhaps should have been on the Maxx. In typical fashion, heaping the blame on himself, when Sam Kieth looked at Ollie Optics' work on some of the other Image books, namely Spawn, I'm guessing, Kieth figured it had to be that he just wasn't very good at communicating. I mentioned that Oliff won Harvey and Eisner Awards in 93, 94, and 95 consecutively for his work on Spawn. As it turns out, Sam Kieth's inability to communicate may or may not have been a factor though, and as it turns out, there was actually probably a much bigger reason that Ollie Optics' work on the Maxx wasn't necessarily as good as on Spawn. While I had long chalked up anything that looked rushed or imperfect to tight deadlines, and probably Sam Kieth turning stuff in fairly late on top of this, Steve Oliff revealed that there were two main reasons that people's work at Image came out not so well, and why that was almost never Spawn. While several of the Image founders definitely had problems with meeting deadlines and were constantly turning art in late and at the last minute, Todd McFarlane usually got his work done in a pretty timely fashion. Spawn had been their first book at Image. Interestingly, this isn't why Oliff and Ollie Optics began to treat Spawn preferentially when it came to their work queue though. And trust me, they most assuredly did just that, especially as time went on. Despite Todd McFarlane being extremely vocal about quote, treating people better than they ever would at other companies, he wasn't the best at actually following through on this promise, to say the least. While this would lead to some rather infamous difficulties for the creator, namely the protracted and costly legal battle with fellow Sandman scribe Neil Gaiman, it also made working for him a dicey proposition for some people. McFarlane absolutely refused to pay any royalties on his books. He didn't give percentages or points on the back end, and it didn't matter what you did on the book or how well you did it. All you ever got were random checks for what seemed like entirely random amounts of money, which Olaf called bonuses and Neil Gaiman famously described as love checks. In reality, they were neither. McFarlane was seemingly using his refusal to pay anything on the back end to play at a much larger game. While Steve Olaf described them as bonuses, what was happening was Todd McFarlane was writing checks and sending them out to certain Ollie Optics employees working on Spawn when the work was done and turned in on time. This was not done in an effort to reward them for good sales or even a job well done, but rather in an effort to ensure that Spawn stayed at the top of the work queue no matter what. Early on, Olaf and Ollie Optics discovered that while Todd McFarlane had zero intention of actually treating them better than other companies, he would pay to get the book done on time. During the early days of Image, this wasn't nearly as problematic, but as the situation with late books and missed deadlines continued to worsen, and Ollie Optics heaped more and more books on their workload, things got slightly out of control. Despite work on a lot of books suffering because of missed deadlines, these love checks assured that Spawn received preferential treatment by a large number of the staff. This constant tardiness also led to another problem that Ollie Optics faced when working with Image during these Halcyon days. As books fell further and further behind schedule, what wound up happening is, as I mentioned, Diamond Distribution would call, threatening to exercise a lateness clause in their contract and fine Image for soliciting titles that took months to come out if they ever did. Actually, more than a little ironically, Darker Image is a wonderful example of just such a title. It was highly touted as not only having Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld in one book, but original creations from both of them and work from Sam Kieth. Darker Image was going to be a behemoth, but had managed to fall behind schedule to the point that its release was in perpetual question before Sam Kieth ever finished his first story. It got so bad that at a certain point, Image instated a set of rules and regulations inside of the company itself. You could only solicit books that had reached certain set benchmarks, and if you solicited a book that never came out, you were supposed to get fined. It was a big problem for several Image founders, and despite efforts to curtail these incidents, books would fall so far behind. Diamond would eventually call up these guys and threaten to start fining people, and if you were getting fined by Diamond, you were also getting fined internally as well. It was this whole big thing, and it would cost you some serious coins, so everyone would go into panic mode, and Steve Olaf and Ollie Optics would end up getting flooded by books from everyone all at the same time. With books from all these guys that were behind the eight ball pouring in constantly, Ollie Optics workers were eager for those bonus love checks that Todd McFarlane would send out. Add to this that he was normally on time, and the fact he had been the one to bring them on board at Image, McFarlane's Spawn work was invariably bumped to the top of the pile and shown preferential treatment by both Steve Olaf as well as many other workers at Ollie Optics. While he has always treated people well, to say the least, Sam Kieth certainly wasn't sending out love checks or bonuses and probably wasn't getting the best out of Ollie Optics that he could have, all things considered. Regardless of any detractors, I personally still love the colors on the original run of the Maxx and a ton of those early Image books, actually. The improvement in color quality seemed to happen almost overnight to me as a kid during the Image Revolution. In reality, this was mostly due to Steve Olaf and Ollie Optics forcing their competitors and other publishers to kick it up a notch. Not only had Olaf and Ollie Optics really stepped up the game in terms of what you could do with the then still fairly limited printing utilized to make comics, but they also introduced another game changer as well, slick paper stock. Admittedly, I'm a newsprint kind of guy. I think maybe my favorite paper stock of all time was during the 80s on some of those higher end books, especially by Marvel, on that thick, grainy Baxter paper. They were still using those absolutely insane, low resolution printing techniques, and seeing all those overlapping colors and dots was just awesome to me. While I love Steve Olaf and indeed much of the art produced by Image, I may never forgive them for the switch to high gloss paper, and apparently this can all be traced back to Steve Olaf and his work on Spawn. As Todd McFarlane continued to explore new avenues to get better printing and color, Steve Olaf suggested that they use slick paper in order to get a better resolution for the colors and line reproduction. Though Olaf has later been quoted as saying Todd McFarlane took the idea too far, apparently Olaf's the guy responsible for the industry-wide switch to that absolutely garbage, high-gloss paper that still plagues a lot of books. His part in questionable paper stocks aside, Olaf and Ollie Optics quickly became the premier coloring studio in the US during the rise of Image. They were so heavily in demand at that time that Olaf couldn't hire enough people to keep up with the rising demand for their services. Olaf continued to expand his empire, and it literally seemed like the sky was the limit for Ollie Optics. That is, until Rob Liefeld would start a ripple effect which would first cripple the company before eventually leading to the demise of Ollie Optics as we know it altogether. If you want an idea of how highly sought after Steve Olaf and Ollie Optics were, here's one more little bit of interesting info. At the height of his power, Rob Liefeld lured color separatist Kikyo Takanashi away from Ollie Optics with a mind-boggling offer of a reported $100,000 a year in 1995, taxes paid. It was madness. Olaf couldn't even get close to touching the offer, and while he was more than a little bit irked, told Takanashi to take Liefeld up on his offer, wishing him well. Sadly, Takanashi was assigned to the changing times, and what ended up happening was that within a year or so, 4 of Olaf's other integral staffers ended up going off to work exclusively for Erik Larsen on Savage Dragon, including Ruben Rude, while several other staffers set out to start companies of their own. The loss of the better part of his staff was difficult enough to deal with, but apparently several of his ex-employees who went into business for themselves actually rifled through Steve Olaf's Rolodex for contacts before they left. With intimate knowledge of how Ollie Optics worked, as well as the fact that Olaf was severely understaffed at the time and how to just undercut him on price, this chain of events very nearly managed in driving Steve Olaf out of the industry completely. The once undeniably titanic Ollie Optics was squeezed out of DC, and following this, began to lose most of their Image work. Soon, their workload was reduced to a series of lower-tier Marvel books like Iron Man and Spider-Man Universe. As the heyday of the speculators' boom came to a close, the industry was left in a state of freefall as sales plummeted month after month, and jobs were disappearing just as quickly as they had once appeared only a few short years before. Olaf and what was left of Ollie Optics were only able to hold on to 2 titles at Image, the Maxx, which they colored all 35 issues of, and Spawn, which they did the first 39 issues of. While this smaller volume of titles might have previously allowed them more time to devote to the Maxx, by this point, Ollie Optics had taken several irrevocable blows to their staff, which they never fully recovered from. The days of being arguably the best US coloring department were long over. By the point they had time to concentrate on the Maxx completely. This probably also contributed to the color work on the Maxx Sam Kieth has always seemed to be so dissatisfied with, and likewise explains Sam Kieth's feelings of not being able to communicate what he wanted. Sam Kieth may have indeed been trying to get a lot of stuff across that just wasn't getting heard. At one point because they were concentrating on Spawn and those bonuses from Todd McFarlane, and then later on because they were simply no longer equipped to handle extraneous requests from Sam Kieth on the Maxx, as they were forced into doing more and more second-tier Marvel titles to keep the lights on. Even now, years later, and knowing that Steve Olaf and Ollie Optics could have done better, I don't care. Recoloring Olaf and Ollie Optic's work on the Maxx is akin to sacrilege to me. I love the colors on the original Maxx, and I'll probably never change my mind about that. Given what I found, I did change my mind about Sam Kieth's decision, though. Given the situation surrounding Steve Olaf and Ollie Optics during the publication of the Maxx, it's not hard to believe that Sam Kieth maybe wasn't getting what he thought he would out of them, or that he tried to communicate what he wanted changed and either never got heard or nothing ever got done about it, at least not to his satisfaction. While I'm still not entirely convinced that there was anything so broken it needed to be fixed to begin with, I never got the feeling that Sam Kieth was going for the easy money and recoloring the Maxx simply as a way to sucker people back into buying the series all over again. Sam Kieth had complained about the colors for years, and this was long before Maximized ever became a thought in anyone's head. So I don't buy that this was some sort of quote-unquote cash grab, which was a term I saw thrown around a lot during the Maximized run. While I might not have thought it was necessary, it made Sam Kieth happy, which made me happy. Plus, it got him to re-examine the original Maxx run for the first time in what felt like forever. More than anything, though, Maximized felt like Sam Kieth trying to find a happy middle ground with a lot of his older fans still hung up on the Maxx and his Marvel Comics Presents works, and the more personal non-superhero work that he personally preferred. When it was announced in 2013, the Maximized series was the first real sign that fans had in decades that Sam Kieth was really willing to even look at that property again. IDW, who handled the Maximized series, also released books around the same time as well, a collection of art called The Worlds of Sam Kieth and Samplings and Dabblings, a companion book for an art exhibit that Sam Kieth hosted that same year. There were more books planned, including the Art of Sam Kieth book, which was supposed to contain the previously unpublished Maxx comic, as well as quote-unquote enough material to sate fans of his Marvel Comics Presents and Sandman work in his words as well. Unfortunately, Sam Kieth was absolutely tapped out from having to deal with both the public at the exhibit as well as the general headaches of the show that he ended up having to take several months off of work altogether. Adding to this already shaken state, Sam Kieth also made a rare and absolutely bizarre appearance at San Diego Comic-Con that year for the 25th anniversary of Sandman. Somehow, they actually managed to get Sam Kieth to agree to sit in on the panel, though admittedly, I don't know why. He seemed basically almost miserable and spent the better part of his time on the stage underplaying his involvement with the series and making his usual self-deprecating jokes about his quote-unquote weird art. 2013 was also the 20th anniversary of the Maxx, and Sam Kieth mysteriously also agreed to take part in a panel about himself on the same day, just following the Sandman panel. For those of us watching with bated breath to see what would happen next, the 2013 San Diego Comic-Con Sam Kieth panel seemed to be a troubling glimpse into what many of us hoped was a man on the road to coming to terms with his legacy in the industry. The Sam Kieth panel was bonkers from the start. Sam Kieth saunters in more than 15 minutes late for his own panel and was obviously uncomfortable from the start with the entire proposition. The panel was hosted by off-time Kieth collaborator, current IDW Special Projects editor, and former Wildstorm Special Projects editor turned editor-in-chief Scott Dunbier. Dunbier ends up not only asking most of the questions, but eventually answering them as well. Sam Kieth seems less than enthused about being at the convention to begin with and spends a good deal of time actually talking about the Sandman panel. It was a surreal thing to see and sad in more ways than one. While many of us had hoped this was Sam Kieth coming out of hiding after all these years, it quickly became apparent he was basically asked to make these appearances in order to promote the work he was releasing at the time. He didn't appear to be very excited about the prospect, and the entire experience of multiple panel appearances along with the art exhibit, putting out 2 art books and the Maximized series, seemed to be indescribably taxing for Sam Kieth. The art of Sam Kieth failed to materialize, and he obviously went through a bit of a rough patch for a while there, having to take a few months off just to recuperate and get his mind clear. Many of us watching the situation with interest and a fair amount of trepidation were relieved that Sam Kieth didn't simply immediately recoil and drop the entire Maxx property entirely again. While no public appearances of note like the San Diego Comic-Con followed, the Maximize series did. It was published monthly by IDW for the entirety of the original 35-issue run and featured 2 covers for each book. One version was a subscription cover, which was basically a remastered version of the original issue's cover from the Image run, and then the B cover, which was an entirely new painting of the Maxx. While a lot of people were still tossing around the term cash grab in a lot of cases, the Maxx Maximized, which ran monthly from 2013 until 2016, featured a sum total of 2 variant covers. A and B covers are very common practice in today's market for comics, and I respected the fact that they didn't produce any extremely limited ratio variants or other incentives for the series other than 2 single 1 in 10 artist edition, and there was a blank cover both for issue 13. While it wasn't a bestseller by any means, Maximize helped to revitalize interest in the Maxx once more and proved to not only be a good entryway for new readers to find the series, but ironically, many fans who had never been able to assemble complete runs of the series were finally able to do so with the reprinted IDW issues. Maximized went off without any real hitches and drove interest in the characters to the point that live-action Maxx films were in talks again, and there was more buzz about the franchise than there had ever been since the mid-90s. In 2016, as a result of renewed interest following the conclusion of the monthly Maximize series, one of the most exciting announcements regarding the Maxx to have ever occurred took place. Initially, some years prior, back in 2013, when Maximize started publication, Sam Kieth had briefly discussed the possibility of artist editions of the Maxx, but nearly 3 years later, nothing had materialized. This was nothing new for Sam Kieth fans, and you have to kind of take whatever he announces as upcoming projects with a grain of salt. Surprisingly, though, in 2016, IDW officially announced the Maxx Artists Edition would be released later on that year. While there had been initial plans for at least the first 12 issues to be released as part of the Artists Edition series by IDW, Kieth made it clear in the preface of the book itself, as well as more than one press release and in several interviews, he only felt like the first 6 issues were worthy of the Artist Edition treatment. Sam Kieth was okay with the first volume. He might not love the work, but a lot of people did, and he was finally ready to share it with them, at least what he saw worth sharing. He appreciated the interest and the support, but he was clear that he wasn't going to exploit fans, in his opinion, by doing a second volume. While I most certainly don't agree that the next 6 issues aren't worth the Artist's Edition treatment, it's awesome to see a creator taking a stance like that. He could have gone for an easy buck, and it would have gone over too. Sam Kieth might not have the most fans, but the fans he does have basically buy everything he does, and most assuredly would have picked up a second $100 plus tome of original art. He could have gone for the easy money, but he didn't. And I respect and I appreciate that fact, despite me actually wanting that second volume. While the second volume would unfortunately never materialize, the Maxx Artists Edition would prove to be a rather important release in one particular regard, especially for longtime Maxx fanatics, despite the fact I could find literally no mention of it in any of the numerous press releases or solicitations for the artist editions. It revealed something many had long suspected, but no one could ever really prove. People had long stipulated that there was more material floating around out there for Darker Image, but little to no reliable information surfaced for so long. Stipulation and whispered rumors on the internet were all that we had to go on. Today, I know for a fact, from an eBay listing of all things, that there was a finished Jim Lee cover for a subsequent issue of Darker Image, supposedly issue 4, though I can't confirm this issue number with any other information aside from the listing itself. Since the series never went beyond the first issue, the cover has remained relatively unseen outside of a solicitation in an issue of Inside Image featuring an uncolored pen and ink only version of the cover. The eBay listing was for a color guide, meaning that the cover had actually been prepped for release at some point. When the series was abandoned, so was the cover, and the color guide eventually found its way into the hands of a collector and onto the internet. Interestingly, the unpublished cover didn't actually go entirely unused. With the help of early digital cropping technology, Bloodwolf and the Maxx were removed from the image, and that cropped version was subsequently used as the cover to Deathblow 4. The fact that the Jim Lee cover was supposed to be for issue 4 strongly suggested that there had been more material, though left in various states of completion when it was abandoned for later issues of Darker Image. Jim Lee has also reportedly said on Twitter that he does have a finished and unpublished story for a subsequent issue, although he made no mention of what issue that would have been to the best of my knowledge. And it turns out that Jim Lee wasn't alone. While we may never see Jim Lee's intended work for the interiors on Darker Image, nearly 23 years after it was first intended for publication, we did get to see Sam Kieth's. As I mentioned before, Sam Kieth actually has an entire issue of the Maxx solo series that he'd gotten so far as scripting and coloring but never had lettered, which he shelved and forgot about for years. Sadly, to the best of my knowledge, that story has still never seen print. While we might never get that other issue, remarkably, when the artist edition was released and you opened it up, you were greeted by this expansive page, which, despite its size, actually displays a somewhat limited table of contents. I remember seeing images of it for the first time online and having to read the sparse words several times. Darker Image issue 1, the Maxx issues 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and Darker Image 2. Most people, I think, just ordered the book based on the fact it was a Maxx Artist's Edition and wanted to see Sam Kieth's original work. Nowhere in any solicitation that I'm aware of was it mentioned that there was a completely unpublished Maxx story exclusive to the release, the fully completed tale intended for the second issue of Darker Image. Sadly, I couldn't afford one of those massive $100 plus tomes as my daughter had just been born, and they've since gone out of print, so I've actually never gotten a chance to read the story, and I can't speak to its quality. Historically speaking, though, I'm beyond delighted that this story was published and preserved for posterity. It was the second story chronologically for the Maxx, making it obviously some of the earliest work done, and it was done by the complete original lineup of Sam Kieth, Jim Sinclair, and William Messner-Loebs. Considering this is the second unreleased Maxx story that Sam Kieth's revealed like this, it really does make me wonder what else Sam Kieth may not even remember that he still has hidden underneath a pile of sketchbooks or in a forgotten drawer in his studio. By this time in 2016, Sam Kieth had somehow miraculously done 35 new covers for the series, a feat many of us had wondered if he were actually capable of, and released a previously unpublished Maxx story. But it seemed like Sam Kieth still kept having to say the same thing in every single interview he gave about his art books, the Maximize Project, and even the Artist's Edition. No, there wasn't any new Maxx material in the works. No, he wouldn't be returning to the series. And no, there was nothing new planned. The Maxx was over, and while he should probably just stop teasing people, he had no plans to return to the character at any point in the future. All the stories had been told. Knowing how impossibly out of reach new Maxx material was, it felt like getting these new stories out was an important moment in the Maxx's history, especially when Sam Kieth contributed a new Maxx story for the Hero Initiative anthology book in 2014. The 5-page story basically equated to the original Maxx cast, explaining that the series didn't really make sense taken as a whole, and that despite what they might think, people did not want Sam Kieth to return to the Maxx. It felt like this was Sam Kieth's final and unequivocal answer to the perpetual questions he invariably faced when talking with almost anyone. As it turned out, I think a lot of the reason that Sam Kieth was so reticent about returning to the Maxx was that the Maxx was just a completely different time in his life. He was not the same person by 2016, and for a number of reasons, many of which he talked about in the introduction to Samplings and Dabblings in 2013, he wasn't able to, quote, go home or back to who he was at the time. Given just how drastically his art and personality had changed, Sam Kieth felt like returning to the Maxx would simply prove to be a disappointing prospect for everyone involved. Sam Kieth has discussed one of the major reasons he believes this, saying he thinks that people don't actually want him to go back to the Maxx so much as they want to go back to that point in their life. They associate the book with this moment in their existence that they now, for some reason, see with rose-colored glasses. The Maxx isn't actually a great series. It's just people associate it with a great part of their lives, and it's simply a wave of nostalgia that people are writing 30 years later at this point. In one interview where he was discussing the characters in Zero Girl, I think Sam Kieth more succinctly summed up his thoughts on the subject than anywhere else I've ever found. Quote, "When you get together with someone after 3 years, you're maybe not the same person anymore, and you can't go back to... Like, when people say they want me to do the Maxx again, or the Maxx to be like it was in the old days, I would say people don't want to go back to the old Maxx. They want to go back to who they were when they were reading that issue. And that's fair. I crack open my Maxx comics for nostalgia factor sometimes. Sometimes. To be fair, I also crack them open because I am constantly discovering something new about the series I have never caught before. Usually just little bits about the story I've missed, or the characters, or even myself. The Maxx has an uncanny ability. It somehow allows me to look deep inside of myself and see the deepest, darkest, and most terrifying truths in a more positive light. To accept them as part of me and not hide from them, but not let them rule me either. The Maxx lets me be okay with being me. In short, it's had a profound impact on me, who I am, who I will be, all of it. And that doesn't feel like simple nostalgia. That feels like the benchmarks of a work of art that has managed to transcend its medium, even its creator, and take on a life entirely its own. Sam Kieth is half right, though. The characters in the Maxx do feel like people I knew, or rather know, but not people I didn't talk to for 3 years. There has never been 3 years go by that I did not read this series, that I didn't look back on it, and the impact that it had on me as a child so many years ago in complete awe and wonder, but to also take it as I am now, so many years later, and able to enjoy facets of the story I was completely unaware of during my adolescence. So I don't think it's about going back or going home. I don't think it's about reconnecting with an old friend, because even though Sam Kieth might have stopped writing and drawing it, me and the Maxx, yet we never stopped talking. Sam Kieth was right, though, when he talked about the Maxx transporting you to another place. But again, I don't think it's a simple obsession with nostalgia. It's an addiction to that feeling. That intimate sense of knowing, and yet that utterly pleasant confusion that washes over you when you're done with an issue. There might be giant slugs running around, or people talking about Cheers, or staring at a stone horse, or even trapped in a closet for pages on end, but no matter how weird it got, it always felt like my weird. Like Sam Kieth and I somehow spoke the same language. When the Maxx went away, I know it was hard for a lot of us because it wasn't just about losing a character or even a creator or anything like that, because Sam Kieth has done plenty of other books since the Maxx. It just felt like there was this big gaping hole where the Maxx used to be, like it was always supposed to be there or something, even though we all knew that obviously couldn't happen. That sense of loss I don't think ever really left me either, and I don't think I'm alone. I know that's going to sound weird to some people, but yeah, I still miss a series from 20 years ago just as much today as I did when it first disappeared from the newsstands. When I first started getting into internet fandom and discovering you could actually talk to, or at least send messages to all these amazing people, one of the first things I wanted to do was reach out and tell Sam Kieth what he meant to me, how much he'd impacted my life, all the amazing things he has made possible for me. And the more I've learned about him since, the worse I felt for that desire in a lot of ways. You have to understand, I literally learned to read because of Sam Kieth. I struggled with dyslexia and dysgraphia growing up. Neither were diagnosed often at the time I was in school, and especially not where I was located in the South. It wasn't until the release of Hulk 368 when I finally hit my breaking point. I was already obsessed with Frank Miller's Dark Knight and Mazzucchelli's Year One work on Batman. I'd been staring at those Batman stories for years. But that issue of the Hulk enthralled me in a way I can't really begin to describe. I remember just so clearly, I had to know what was happening in this Hulk comic, and sitting down and just beating my head against a wall for days. I knew I wasn't stupid. I just hadn't figured out how to beat whatever was stopping me from reading, and I was done. I was going to know what the hell was going on in this Hulk comic, come hell or high water. Sam Kieth's art gave me that push. By using his art as an anchor point, after several days it finally clicked. I figured out how to get the words to stop moving and jumbling, and I was finally able to read that comic. Sam Kieth opened an entire world to me that I would have never known existed had it not been for him. I figured out how to read, but it was Sam Kieth's art that was the reason. Consequently, Sam Kieth's art took on a much larger meaning to me, so it was a big deal to me when he got a book announcement at Image a while after that. I could not wait to read his book. When the Wizard magazine promotional card was released right around the time of the first issue of the Maxx, I remember flipping out. When you turned the card over, right there in big, bold, bright letters, it actually said the Maxx was the world's first dyslexic hero. I still don't know if it was a joke or why Sam Kieth could have possibly made the Maxx dyslexic. At the time, it didn't matter. For me, it was a sign. From that point on, Sam Kieth's name has been inseparably linked to my life. I literally don't know what my life would be like had it not been for Sam Kieth and his art. And for 30 years, I wanted to tell him that. I just wanted to thank him for everything he'd done for me, like a million other people out there, to tell him how amazing his art was and how much it had inspired me and my life. I wanted to do it because it would make me feel good, absolutely. I also wanted to say it to him because I thought it would make him feel good. I wanted him to know the kind of impact his work has had on people, the type of life-changing events that he's caused by simply being the amazing person and artist that he is. After years of reading interviews and listening to him talk, that's the last thing I would say to Sam Kieth now. This documentary has made me understand how heavy what I want to say is, especially to someone like Sam Kieth. I would try my best not to utter a single word of it, to just let our meeting be what it is, congenial and pleasant, to nod my head, thank him for the signature, maybe beg him for a doodle, and then quietly walk away. I don't know if I could do it though, but I would try my hardest. Dale Keown points out what an uphill battle complimenting Sam Kieth is at one point. Sam Kieth reinforces this in nearly any interview you've ever read with him. Jim Lee, the list goes on and on. Though I think William Messner-Loebs probably summed it up best in his Epicurus introduction. What I didn't understand when I read that, and I have a much firmer grip of now, is why Sam Kieth feels that way. There are people whose lives and realities and perspectives have been indelibly shaped by this man's work. I'm walking proof, and I know I'm far from alone, but there are people who have met their husbands and wives and gone into professions all because of Sam Kieth and his work on the Maxx. Their lives and existence, just as mine, has been informed by Sam Kieth's work in an extremely important way. work that he's not necessarily that proud of at this point. Telling someone that you are who you are because of them. I mean, that is an incredible thing to put on anyone. For Sam Kieth, who really cares about people and I think is a profoundly gentle and caring soul, it feels like this is simply too much. We could spend all day playing armchair analyst and trying to understand why Sam Kieth can't accept compliments about his work, but the truth is, he just can't. When you tell him this stuff, not only does it bring up a whirlwind of emotions about the situation you're discussing with him, but all these negative thoughts about his work as well. It's not a pleasant thing for him. I again feel like Sam Kieth quite accurately summed up his feelings on the subject when discussing the Zero Girl. One of the things about her getting stuck on him, continuing to want to go back, clearly he's not there to go back to. Like, she's projecting on him, all this stuff. I mean, there's no way that anybody can fill that emptiness inside you. And it's just an impossible place to be, to look to somebody else and ask for somebody to fill that. It's just your lot to have this big, soft, gaping hole inside of you. When people look up to you like that, and they hold you on a pedestal and expect all these things of you, for you to look a certain way and act a certain way and draw and write and do everything in a certain way, they hold you to a higher standard. They glorify your every move until eventually you let them down. You slip, and those same people eat you alive. That pedestal that they had you on before is like a steak now that they're preparing to burn you at. Because for them, Sam Kieth is just a name in a book. A book about all these larger-than-life subjects and themes and other worlds. It's magic. For them, it's easy because Sam Kieth isn't a real person. He's a name and a byline. The problem is, he is a person. Sam Kieth was never interested in being anyone's idol. He just wants to draw and write and live in peace and make a living doing what he was obviously born to do, even if he would argue on that point with you. He's never been comfortable with people giving him praise, as William Messner-Loebs attested in his introduction to I-B4E, and I'm not sure there's any more wonderfully public example than his appearance at the San Diego Comic-Con Sandman 25th anniversary panel in 2013 I mentioned before. Neil Gaiman tried repeatedly to compliment Sam Kieth, who made his best attempt to not crap on his work in the book, all the while, of course, completely crapping on his work in the book, as well as minimizing his impact on the groundbreaking series he helped launch. The thing that became most painfully evident when reading transcripts from the panel was that Sam Kieth was incapable of accepting he'd done anything of merit or worth on the title. Whereas Neil Gaiman, I think, is quite cavalier about having the same kind of impact on people's lives that working on something like Sandman or the Maxx comes with. And yes, I just put those books in the same category of amazing. Deal with it. It's not something that entirely ever entered Sam Kieth's mind when he was doing the work. I don't think Neil Gaiman necessarily takes anything for granted. But Sam Kieth just isn't capable of being nearly as cavalier about a lot of things as Neil Gaiman is. And this includes public appearances. The press and stuff like interviews never taken with the spotlight or the attention that it brought. The rare convention appearances by Sam Kieth, as well as the art exhibit and the Maximized series, gave fans some hope he was willing to at least deal with the Maxx again. But there had also been the never-released art of Sam Kieth, as well as a dozen or more books that he'd announced during this period which never materialized, and the months he had to take off. Between 2013 and 2016, it seemed the Maximized series had eaten up most of its time. He'd eked out a few things, but as 2018 approached, there were suspiciously few announcements from Sam Kieth. He seemed to be withdrawing once more from the world, and with the first two volumes of the Maximized series having already been collected and released by the end of 2016 in trade paperback format, for most of us, I think, who were kind of shocked he'd done anything else with the series to begin with, We assumed this was the last we would ever see of the big purple lummox and his buxom full-bodied companion. As it turned out, nothing could have been further from the truth. I was in sheer disbelief when I read the first announcements about the Maximized series and the 35 new covers by Sam Kieth. I actually remember where I was sitting when I read the first article, and then the second, and the third, because I couldn't believe it. I was happy, but it came as such a surprise. I actually remember thinking it was a hoax, using some unpublished Maxx stuff that he'd posted to his blog as the new cover images. In July of 2013, though, I knew I was reading a fake article. There was no way Sam Kieth was going to be bringing back the Maxx. Whoever had come up with the fake articles had even felt the need to make them completely unbelievable on top of that. The Maxx teaming up with Batman, I mean, talk about trolling, but the articles kept popping up. And then I saw an official Twitter post about it, and I honestly didn't know what to think. I was excited, but I remember looking over at my buddy and saying, this is never going to come out. There's no way Sam Kieth is going to actually do this. The more I thought about it, the more sense it made, though. In the whole the Maxx makes the sense you make out of it kind of way, that is, when I really stopped to think about it, the Maxx wasn't ever going to outsell Superman, but there had been a decent amount of money to be made off of a Maxx book now that Sam Kieth owned it again. Looking back, actually, with the new Maximized series covers and the artist edition and the new collections and the art book, it felt like Sam Kieth had been kind of working himself up to this. It almost made sense, but it still seemed completely unreal. Details about how Batman Maxx Arkham Dreams actually came to be are a little bit dicey. Sam Kieth had been cultivating a very good working relationship with and producing a pretty sizable amount of work for DC since 2013, namely a number of self-contained Batman miniseries like Scratch, as well as numerous other pieces by 2018. Over the previous 5 years, he'd not only become pretty synonymous with Batman, but he'd also developed a healthy working relationship with DC in general during the process. In the intervening years since the Maxx's original release under the Image banner, Jim Lee had sold his Wildstorm imprint to DC before he eventually joined the company himself as well. The same Jim Lee that had gotten Sam Kieth to publish the Maxx in the first place, funnily enough. Although Jim Lee wasn't involved with the series in a direct manner that I know of, as he'd been steadily moving up the ranks at DC, I have no doubt he was an instrumental part in advocating for Sam Kieth when he asked to use Batman for the potential crossover. Unfortunately, I can only guess at this. There's been no details that I know of released as to why Sam Kieth suddenly chose to include an actual superhero in the book, or even the general impetus that spurred him on to return to the Maxx 20 years after it initially disappeared from newsstands seemingly overnight. Personally, I expected a lot more fireworks when Batman Maxx Arkham Dreams was announced by IDW Publishing. I sometimes take for granted that while we're an outspoken bunch, Sam Kieth's work is for a somewhat niche audience. In some ways, the inclusion of Batman felt like a way to kind of bridge the gap between Sam Kieth's fans who knew about the Maxx and were probably buying the series solely based on the artist's return to the character after 2 decades, and the much wider Batman readership that was by this time familiar with both Sam Kieth's name and work on the character. Again, though, this is entirely stipulation. Although Arkham Dreams certainly wasn't a blockbuster announcement, it raised a lot of eyebrows, especially among people in the know about Sam Kieth's long-held views on returning to the Maxx. As news of the series spread, a lot of us old Maxx heads started crawling out of the woodwork. We were excited, confused, and I think a little bit scared that Sam Kieth might have been right all these years about not returning to the work somehow. His writing style, his art, his entire personality and career had undergone a dramatic change since the Maxx had ceased publication. It felt like, in a lot of ways, there was simply no predicting what direction Sam Kieth was going to take the story, or even what it was going to look like. Well, I don't know what I expected. Arkham Dreams certainly wasn't it. I don't mean that in a negative way either. The series looked absolutely incredible, in my opinion, far exceeding my expectations in many regards, actually. Some of the Arkham Dreams panels are on par with his work on those early Maxx issues. The composition and construction of his pages, while not necessarily quite as experimental or dramatically strange as they once were, are beyond stellar. Despite whatever issues he may or may not have had with his wrist, Sam Kieth did not skimp when it came to the art on those books. Make no mistake, it looks different. This is not the same Maxx you remember from the first 21 issues of the original run. It has a decidedly more cartoonish feel in a lot of regards, probably owing in no small part to Dave Feiss and the influence he had on his cousin's work over the years. While this might be a deterrent for some people, that's just the evolution of Sam Kieth's style and his work since the publication of the original Maxx series in the 1990s, and I think most people that felt this way had already kind of gravitated away from Sam Kieth's work by this point. In actuality, though, Sam Kieth was already starting this phase of his art in earnest by the time the Maxx 10 had been released in 1994, so I don't honestly know what people expected in that regards. But again, I don't think Arkham Dreams was it, despite what I was sure was going to be a whole lot of people whining about how Sam Kieth wasn't drawing the Maxx like he did in 1993. The main critiques of the series were centered around the story, and to be brutally honest and fair, they have a lot of valid points. The story was nothing to write home about. It wasn't insufferably stupid or anything, but sadly, Sam Kieth's words rang true in my ears when I finished it. It felt unneeded, but I think, to be quite honest and fair to Sam Kieth, anything that he did with the series was going to be anticlimactic one way or another after 20 years of waiting. Batman played a really good foil to the Maxx. The characters were fun, but the story felt inconsequential. And the writing, it was a bit amateurish at best during certain points, to say the very least. It was hard to tell if this was Sam Kieth having fun and kind of self-deprecatingly making meta-commentary on his work, as is apparent sometimes, or an unintended side effect of sandwiching the universes of Batman and the Maxx together. It was fun enough to just see Batman and the Maxx interacting, with Batman being constantly annoyed by the spastic and forgetful anti-hero attempting to lead him through the laughably strange world of the Outback. Like I said, it was nothing to write home about, but I was just happy to be seeing the Maxx and Julie again after all these years. I would happily run out to the shop and pick up both covers on the day they were released, greedily devouring them before I would even leave the store many times. Like clockwork, and almost surprisingly, the initial 3 issues came out in September, October, and November of 2018, just as planned and solicited. Then, issues just stopped showing up. At first, many of us had hoped this was just Sam Kieth taking his time with the art. He would systematically fall behind on a lot of what he worked on over the years. It was no big deal. It happened. As the weeks turned to months, and those months kept getting longer and longer, however, it started to seem that perhaps even Sam Kieth might have over-anticipated his ability to return to the Maxx. If you follow it, Sam's blog has become Kieth's lifeline to the world over the past 12 years or so. After having started in 2010, the blog currently showcases what I can only describe as an absolutely stunning collection of original art, unpublished and personal work, as well as copious amounts of these tiny little notes from Sam Kieth. While they're invariably short and sweet, these small bits of flavor text many times describe what was going on behind the scenes during the creation of whatever it is you happen to be looking at. The narration will describe the set of circumstances which resulted in the image being altered or not seen, or whatever else might have made him post it for people to check out at this point. It's the one place where you can look to when you're trying to piece together Sam Kieth's version of events reliably these days. And believe it or not, he's pretty good about posting. For a while, I know it was a way for him to kind of take the news group idea to the next level. He could do the blog and interact with fans to whatever extent he did or didn't want, and remain in his comfort zone while keeping his fans interested and up to date. He never really responded to comments, like as in ever that I know of, but as far as I can tell, they've been completely disabled as of this point in 2022. Regardless of the comment section, Sam's blog is his link to the land of the living. Sam Kieth often jokingly says that it's the only way that fans know he's still alive. They can check on there once a week and be reassured that he's still kicking. While it grew from humble beginnings with 50 or less posts a year for a while, by 2017, a year before Arkham Dreams began publication, Kieth posted a whopping 350 times. 2018 saw 307 posts, and 2019 ended with 350 posts as well. The reason I bring this up is that Sam Kieth posts progress pics profusely to this page. He knows that people love seeing his rough pencils and finished uncolored inks, and they're oftentimes the center of a post when he comes across a random piece of art that he doesn't detest on that given day, or say he has something on his work table. This meant by the time that Arkham Dreams began its unannounced hiatus in 2018, using the blog, you could basically track Sam Kieth's progress on the series weekly by what you saw, and sometimes, just as importantly, what you didn't see. While it appears that up until around January of 2019, Sam Kieth was managing work on the series all right, posts about the series abruptly ceased just before February that year. It wouldn't be until about 3 months later, in April, that Sam Kieth would address the situation when popping back up to apologize for having fallen behind. He promised he was getting back on track with the series at that point in mid-2019, before promptly falling even further behind at that point. Over what has become known as the long, or sometimes the lost year, about every 3 months like clockwork, Sam Kieth would post a page or an absolutely insane panel from Batman Maxx, apologize for being late, and promise he was still working on it. Then the project would fall completely silent again for months on end. Eventually, it hit a point that Sam Kieth himself created not one, but 2 images of the Maxx and Batman, mocking the artist himself about the series, which were actually used as the covers for a collection of the first 3 issues IDW subsequently released called the Lost Year Compendium, which was released to help readers remember what they'd even read when the series finally did wrap up. At a point, I honestly assumed he'd just thrown in the towel, but apparently that wasn't the case. It wasn't that he didn't work on it, or even that he didn't want to work on it. I feel like eventually it was just a chore for him, though. And I don't mean this in the sense that most freelance artists in the comic book and other fields like graphic design feel like creating these stupid, repetitive images are a chore. I mean this in the sense that, try as he might, as successful and profitable a thing as it might be for him to do, working on the Maxx just isn't who Sam Kieth is anymore. From the moment the original Maxx series had started, the fakes and phonies had literally almost destroyed his life more than once. There was the lawsuits and liars, people out to take advantage of him and even take his creation away from him. The initial run of the Maxx was as much a difficult time for Sam Kieth as one of prosperity at most points. All of that has become inexorably linked with the Maxx for Sam Kieth, I think. In his head, the property was dead, whether we like to hear that as fans or not. Even by the time that he had finished the initial series, Sam Kieth had repeatedly said that he told the story that he set out to tell, and that he's not inordinately pleased with a lot of the issues from that series to begin with. The art or the writing, or sometimes both, are literally painful for Sam Kieth to cringingly look back on. I said it once before, but it really feels like Sam Kieth is incapable of continued work on any project where he doesn't feel a deep personal connection on some level. It's his greatest strength and his Achilles heel, and it doesn't seem to be a secret that Sam Kieth lost connection with Arkham Dreams halfway through the series. At a certain point, looking at his blog, it feels like he was simply unable to force himself to sit down and churn out pages of art for something he didn't care about. He spent months working himself back into a headspace where he was once again able to tackle the project and devote his artistic skills to it the way he felt that it deserved. It wouldn't be until October of 2020 that issues 4 and 5 of Arkham Dreams would finally see print. After more than 2 years of waiting, it's nothing short of a miracle that the end of the series ever got published to begin with. By the time it did, though, any real interest that it had initially managed to garner was steamrolled by an astounding 25-month publishing gap. All things considered, I do also have to say, it almost felt like Sam Kieth intentionally sabotaging the Maxx once again. Subconscious or not, it would be months between his posts about it on his blog, and it was clear he just couldn't maintain focus on it for long enough to get the work done, despite what I think was a clear lack of interest by Sam Kieth to work on the series and the Maxx in general. People continued to speculate about the future of the franchise. In many ways, this is the channel that Sam Kieth and the Maxx built. I posted part 1 of how the Maxx broke Sam Kieth in July of 2020 when the Batman Maxx series very much seemed to be dead. The story of the Maxx told, ending once and for all on the ultimate cliffhanger. I felt comfortable having a clear in and out with the series, but not long after I posted the original video, I lost my research. I mean everything. My notes, my script, my sources, my scans, email archives, it was all gone. In a lot of ways, I was back to where I started, but I was lucky to be getting a few hundred views a month on the channel at that time. So losing the research was annoying, but no big deal really. No one was going to care anyway. Then the video started racking up more daily views and subscribers than I'd managed to get in an entire year. And this was day after day. In the year that it has taken me to get this piece back together, the hours I have spent analyzing and pulling apart every bit of information that I could about him, I feel like I understand what Sam Kieth is talking about when he talks about the Maxx. I had mountains of information, but it felt like a hollow victory. There was nothing that revealed what I wanted to about the artist who had become a part of my everyday life at this point. I ate, slept, and breathed Sam Kieth. I was continually looking, searching, doing interviews, sending emails, hounding anyone that I could for information so I could get that piece of information that would crack the entire thing wide open. After what seemed an eternity, I thought I'd found it when I discovered the lawsuits, but that wasn't it. That's not what this video or this journey has been about. Not for me. It's been a quest for an answer to a question I don't even know why I still bother asking. And one I'm pretty sure I ultimately don't want an answer to. I had wanted to know if there would ever be more Maxx. I could say otherwise, but after 2 years of work on this piece, I can tell you that was my real motivation. In the end, I was just like everyone else. I wanted to know the end of the story. I wanted it all wrapped up in a nice, pretty little bow, but this is Sam Kieth we're talking about. Nothing about the man is cut and dried, black and white. His world is a technicolor landscape of ever-changing shades of gray. So I spent 17 months agonizing over what I initially believed once was going to be another hour-long episode to finish up the series. I spent over a year just getting a rough idea of everything that I thought had to be included. I kept going back and adding and revising and editing and tweaking. I knew I was going to let someone down, get something wrong, leave someone out, and I felt a responsibility to all these people who have shown the channel an incredible amount of support over the intervening months. I'm just one man. I know I'm going to miss and mess stuff up, but I knew someone was going to get in the comments section and ask that question. Is there going to be more Maxx? Is it possible? Do you think it will happen? And I wasn't going to have an answer. It was nerve-wracking to make people wait an entire year and then not have a true resolution to the story that you're telling them. To leave things on this diabolical cliffhanger, it didn't seem fair. Eventually, I decided it had been long enough. I was letting down more people than I could ever hope to disappoint with a bad video by not getting anything done. So hesitantly, I started writing a final draft of the script for this documentary around August of 2021. Then, as if he heard my troubled thoughts and came to my aid of all the people and all the sources, I never thought I would hear what I considered to be a definitive answer straight from the source. But I think Sam Kieth did provide a definitive answer to this question himself not long ago on his blog. In January of 2020, just a few months prior to the eventual conclusion of Arkham Dreams, Sam Kieth posted an image of an air whale saying that he had plans to use it in a, quote, new Maxx graphic novel. The image didn't appear in the Batman Maxx series, and it caused rampant speculation that Sam Kieth might be working on some Maxx material, conceivably behind closed doors, preferring to wait until it was finished to announce anything due to the publishing gap on Arkham Dreams. As much as I would love this to be the truth, even then I disagreed with this, and I think Sam Kieth has more recently provided the final word on the subject in one of the tiny snippets of information on one of his numerous blog posts. Perhaps the air whale was meant for a panel, though it is possible it was also meant for some other proposed Maxx project at that time in early 2020. The post from August 2021, Maxx Gone and Bubbles, pretty well lays the theory about any further Maxx material to rest, in my opinion, though. It nails shut not only the ending of Arkham Dreams, but the original Maxx series as well. Quote, towards the end of the first Maxx series, I created Bubbles. Variations on reality as a backdoor way of returning should I wish to do another Maxx miniseries down the road. Though I didn't know it at the time, years later, Batman Maxx would wind up being the last Maxx story I drew. I know what you're thinking. Sam Kieth has said that he would never come back to the Maxx for years, and yet here we are. There's something about the word choice here that makes me believe him this time, though. In the past, he's always said he had told the story he set out to tell, and a few other things, but over the years, he has never said the last Maxx story. This level of finality from a guy who I think chooses his words fairly carefully is hard to misinterpret to me. Some of the illustrations in the Arkham Dreams issues are absolutely just as iconic as anything else Sam Kieth has ever worked on, in my opinion, and they're packed with insane detail as well. The reason it took him so long to get the issues done is because he's just not able to phone stuff in like most people. That's not a viable way to make a living, and the entire thing seemed laborious for Sam Kieth at a certain point, to say the least. While he's capable enough of handling the character for projects like the stunning Maxx calendars that he's doing with Clover Press, pinups and covers for collections, limited lithographs and prints and that kind of thing, for better or worse, I think I can safely say that Sam Kieth's days of drawing interiors on the Maxx appear to be at an end. For a story almost as difficult to follow, as long and complicated but strangely satisfying as the Maxx itself, it was strange to have discovered such a definitive ending to things. But there's always that nagging doubt lingering just beneath the surface of my subconscious. In the years I've been writing this piece, I've learned to never truly trust anything that Sam Kieth says. Mind you, it's not because he's a liar. Far from it. He happens to be one of the most honest and straightforward guys out there, but he wears his heart on his sleeve and speaks straight from the heart, and the heart changes over time just like people do. Maybe. Just maybe. As he gets older, as time passes, and the ugly behind-the-scenes fights and disagreements become just a little bit less vibrant and clear in his memory, Sam Kieth will come to a place where he's at least okay with the Maxx. It's a part of who he is and who he always will be, and when that happens, well, maybe, just maybe, the Maxx will return. but I wouldn't hold my breath. When we fans look back at the Maxx, pleasant memories of discovering the comic or the cartoon come flooding back into our brains. We're instantly intoxicated by euphoria, riding a pleasant wave of dopamine back to our teenage years. For Sam Kieth, when he looks at the Maxx, all he sees are legal headaches and people out to take him for all he's worth, all the hours of drawing and constantly working against impossible deadlines, the pure mental and physical exhaustion required to produce those pages. Those pages and those years of work took a mental and physical toll on Sam Kieth, and when he looks at them, he doesn't see good things like we do. He sees all the little things that he would change and all the things that drive him nuts. Thankfully, as time passes, while Sam Kieth's opinion of the Maxx and his work on the series seems to have remained relatively the same, his ability to see enjoyment in the series through the eyes of his fans does seem to be growing to a certain extent. I read numerous pieces where he says that it doesn't really matter what he thinks of the series now. It's up to the readers to decide what's good and bad and what they do and don't like, and what he thinks doesn't really matter anymore. While it might not be glowing acceptance, when it comes to his work on the Maxx, I think it's the closest we might ever get. He's proven himself more than capable of reinventing his career on his time and terms and is no longer tethered to the character like he once was. Today, he's telling the stories he wants to tell, how he wants to tell them, and they look the way that he wants them to look. They say that time heals all wounds, and while the Maxx may have broke Sam Kieth at one point, every bone he broke seems to have healed twice as strong. Rather than give in or give up, Sam Kieth doubled down on his art and his craft. He used his skill and intelligence to manifest the career he wanted for himself, regularly working on some of the biggest and most iconic characters and franchises in comic book history today, proving time and time again he is far more than just the guy who drew the Maxx or the weird guy who draws big feet. Through decades of intense perseverance, an incredible amount of skill, and the ability to know that even falling on your face is moving forward sometimes, Sam Kieth has rightfully and successfully carved out an irrefutable place for himself among the legends of the comic book industry. In the process, he's also endeared himself to untold fans across the planet and created one of the most ravenous and loyal fan bases in the entire medium. Just don't try and tell him any of that. Like William Messner-Loebs said, you'll only get an argument. Thanks so much for sticking with me. I know this has been a long time coming. I have a few other Sam Kieth related videos, but I thought I owed it to you all to finally get this done. I hope it was worth the wait and you enjoyed, maybe even learned something. If you did enjoy what you saw, think about getting in the comments section below and letting me know. Share these videos with your friends. If you really enjoyed what you saw, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell so you never miss another video or premiere again. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to tons of behind the scenes posts, exclusive content like uncut interviews, and you can even get your name in the credits. If Patreon is not your thing, but you still want to support the channel, have no fear. After 2 years, I can finally offer memberships right here on YouTube. Just click the little join button and make sure you select the tier and perks that fit you best. You can also make one-time donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel using the Ko-Fi link in the description below as well. If that's not enough, you can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen now. This video was made possible by the Jerk Broadcasting Service as well as generous grants from the Patreon, Ko-Fi, and YouTube members you see on the screen now. I'd like to seriously thank every single one of you who has chosen to support the channel this year. I think the quality of the videos has really been improving, and I just hope I'm doing you all proud. Thank you to every single one of you that chooses to support this channel. I couldn't do these videos without your help, and it means the world to me, and I have some big plans for this upcoming year, so keep an eye on the channel, and thank you again from the bottom of my heart. I hope this series has been worth the wait. This has been the channel that the Maxx and Image built, so thank you all for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something, and as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep hitting those local shops, and keep reading comics.